When two Japanese sisters stepped off a buckboard at the Vance Ranch in the summer of 1882, the wealthy rancher who'd sent for a bride took one look at the quiet one and chose her on the spot. Everyone in that Wyoming territory called him a fool, because the older sister was the pretty one, the talker, the one who smiled right and knew how to please a room. What no one knew was that the woman Tucker Vance chose had been trained since she could stand in ways the men of the frontier had never seen, and wouldn't believe if he told them. When the outlaw crew that had been gutting ranches across the basin came for his land, they found out what quiet really cost. Stay until the end to see how this unfolds. Hit that like button, and comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels. The buckboard came up the switchback road in a cloud of pale dust, hauling two women instead of one, and the foreman, standing at the Vance Ranch gate, saw it before anyone else did. He'd been expecting a single bride, arranged through a matchmaker in San Francisco, whose letters had described one woman, not two. The buckboard was the working vehicle of the frontier, built for hauling freight and surviving roads that would shake a carriage to kindling, and it rode rough enough that both women gripped the side rails with white knuckles as the wheels ground over the last stretch of broken ground. The older sister came down first. Hanoka had the same jet-black hair and fair skin as her sister, but she wore hers loose past her shoulders, and she was already smiling at the ranch hands before her boots hit the dirt. Her kimono was a pale blue cotton, simple but clean, and she moved with the ease of someone who knew how to make a room comfortable. She looked at the foreman and dipped her head, and the foreman, who hadn't smiled at a stranger in 6 years, smiled back without thinking. Kasumi came down second. She was smaller, thinner in a way that spoke of long travel and shorter rations, and her hair was pinned in a traditional Japanese knot at the back of her neck, jet black and straight, not a strand out of place. Her kimono was dark, a deep indigo, and she wore a dust-coated travel coat over it that had seen weeks of trail weather. Under one arm she carried a long bundle wrapped in oilcloth, something narrow and rigid that didn't match anything else on the buckboard, and that nobody asked about because nobody knew what to make of it. Her face was all sharp angles beneath high cheekbones, almond-shaped dark eyes that took in the yard, the fence line, the barn, the house, all of it, in one sweep that lasted 2 seconds and gave nothing away. She didn't smile or dip her head. She stood in the road dust with the posture of someone who expected to be tested and was already waiting. Tucker Vance stepped out of the ranch house onto the porch. He was a big man, not tall but thick through the chest and shoulders, with the kind of sun-darkened skin that came from 20 years of working land in the open. He wore clean work clothes and a hat he'd brushed for the occasion, which the hands noticed because Tucker Vance didn't brush his hat for anyone. He walked down the porch steps, crossed the yard, and stopped in front of both women. The foreman later said the whole thing took 3 seconds. Tucker looked at Hanoka, who smiled and inclined her head again, then at Kasumi, who did nothing. He turned to the foreman and said one word, and the word was her. Hanoka's smile didn't break, but it changed, the warmth draining out of it like water through cracked wood. The foreman opened his mouth, closed it, and looked at the buckboard driver for some kind of explanation. The driver shrugged. The matchmaker had sent 2 sisters and 1 letter, and the letter had described the pretty one, and the rancher had just chosen the other. Kasumi extended her hand, not to shake, but palm up, the way you'd offer something to someone. Tucker took it, and her grip was dry and steady, and she held his eyes for the full length of the contact without blinking, without smiling, without fear. A ranch hand standing near the water trough turned to another and muttered something about the Chinese, getting the country wrong, and the second hand shrugged because it didn't matter to either of them what country she was from. What mattered was that the wealthiest man in the basin had just bet his name on a woman who sat in the dirt like she owned it. The Vance Ranch sat on 2,000 acres of grass and spring water in the Wyoming Territory, the largest spread in the basin, and it had made Tucker Vance a wealthy man by frontier standards. He ran 400 head of cattle, kept a crew of hands through the season, and lived in a house with 4 rooms and a plank floor, which by local standards was a mansion. The nearest town was a day's ride south, a collection of dusty buildings that existed because someone had been too tired to keep going and had hammered a sign into the dirt. Tucker had everything a man could build with his hands and his money. What he didn't have was someone to talk to who wasn't on his payroll. Every voice he heard in a day belonged to a man who worked for him, and every conversation bent around the fact that he signed the wages. He'd tried the local women, the ones in town, the ranchers' daughters from the neighboring spreads, and every one of them had looked at his land the way a buyer looks at a horse. They wanted the ranch. He wanted a person. A merchant who traded goods between San Francisco and the territory had told him about Japanese women of the samurai class, educated and disciplined, raised to run a household with authority. The merchant described them as women who carried themselves like they'd been taught to matter, not just to decorate. Tucker had listened, asked questions for an hour, and written a letter to a matchmaker that night. He wanted a partner, and the frontier didn't seem to grow them, so he looked across the ocean. The letters that came back described Hanoka, and so did the photograph. The matchmaker had written about a woman who was warm, sociable, quick to learn, and Hanoka was all of those things on paper. But when the buckboard arrived and Tucker stood in front of both sisters, he saw something in the younger one's stillness that the letters couldn't capture, and the photograph hadn't shown. She sat straight-backed and unafraid in a strange country, on a rough wagon, in a yard full of men who were already judging her, and she looked at all of it the way a person looks at weather. Something to be read, not feared. He chose her in 3 seconds because he recognized the look. He'd seen it once before, in the mirror, the year he'd nearly lost the ranch to drought and fire, and had decided he'd die on the land before he'd run from it. That kind of stillness wasn't emptiness, but a decision already made. The town heard about his choice within a week. The general store owner told the sheriff told the saloon keeper, and the ranchers' wives talked about it over their fences with the kind of precision that suggested they'd been practicing. A Japanese bride was strange enough to fill a month of conversation, but choosing the lesser sister over the pretty one was proof that Tucker Vance had finally lost his mind. The sheriff, who was a clerk with a badge and no jurisdiction outside town limits, offered that he hoped Tucker knew what he was doing. Nobody else was that generous. Hanoka stayed at the ranch because the arrangement had included passage for 1 bride and the matchmaker had sent 2, and there was nowhere else for the second sister to go. Tucker gave her the spare room and didn't say much about it, and Hanoka thanked him with a smile that suggested she understood the situation and intended to make the best of it. Kasumi moved her things into the main bedroom with the same quiet efficiency she did everything else, and on the first night she sat on the edge of the bed and opened the lacquered wooden box she'd carried across the ocean in her lap. The oilcloth bundle went under the bed, pushed to the back against the wall, and she didn't unwrap it. Kasumi's first week on the ranch was defined by what she didn't do. She didn't try to win anyone over, didn't explain herself, didn't apologize for being there, and didn't ask a single question about how anything worked. Instead, she watched. She watched how the cook stoked the stove, how the hands stacked firewood, where the well was, which fence gate stuck, which horse pulled left, how the morning light moved across the yard. She walked the full perimeter of the ranch at dawn on her second day, before anyone was awake, in her kimono and a pair of borrowed boots that were 2 sizes too large, and by the time the cook put coffee on, she knew the layout better than hands who'd been there a year. She wore her kimono every day, dark indigo, sometimes the lighter one for work, always Japanese, always clean. The ranch hands stared for the first 3 days, then stopped staring because she gave them nothing to stare at. She moved through the yard and the kitchen and the barn with the kind of purpose that made staring feel stupid. One hand asked the foreman if she ever planned to dress like a normal person, and the foreman told him he didn't think she cared what normal looked like, and that was the end of it. The medicine box went on the kitchen shelf on the first morning. It was a lacquered wooden case, small enough to carry in one hand, inlaid with a pattern of cranes and cherry blossoms in gold and red that the ranch hands couldn't read and didn't try to. Inside, the box held rows of paper packets filled with dried herbs, a silk roll of fine acupuncture needles, and a small stone mortar and pestle. Kasumi set it on the shelf the way she set everything, with a precision that suggested it had sat on shelves before, in other kitchens, in another country, and it belonged wherever she put it. The box had been her grandmother's. It had been used in Kyoto before Kasumi was born, passed from mother to daughter through a line of women who treated the sick in their community with herbs and needles and the accumulated knowledge of a tradition older than the country Kasumi now stood in. Kasumi didn't explain any of this, because no one asked, and because she had learned long ago that explaining was a form of asking to be understood, and she didn't ask for things. The first time anyone saw her use it was the day a horse kicked Jed in the thigh. Jed was a steady hand, quiet and capable, and the kick caught him square in the leg while he was pulling a shoe. He went down in the dirt, and by the time two hands carried him to the bunkhouse porch, his thigh had swollen to twice its size, and the skin had gone a mottled purple that the foreman called trouble. Tucker sent a hand to ride for the doctor in town, a day's ride each way, and the foreman looked at Jed's leg and looked at the sky and kept what he was thinking to himself. Kasumi knelt beside Jed without asking permission. She opened the medicine box on the porch boards, selected 3 paper packets, and mixed the contents in the mortar with a splash of water from the canteen. She packed the paste against the swelling, then unrolled the silk and selected needles so fine they caught no light, and she pressed them into points along Jed's thigh and hip with a steady hand, while Jed bit down on a leather strap and the ranch hands watched in silence. She worked for 20 minutes without speaking, and when she was done, she washed her hands in the water trough and went back to the kitchen. By morning, the swelling was half what it had been, and Jed could stand. The purple had faded to a bruised yellow, and the pain had dropped from something that made him sweat to something he could walk on. The doctor arrived at noon, looked at the leg, looked at the needle marks, and asked who had treated it. The foreman pointed at the kitchen, where Kasumi was grinding herbs with the mortar and pestle, and the doctor stood in the doorway for a long time before saying anything. Tucker watched the whole thing from the yard. He didn't ask her how she knew what to do, and she didn't offer. Something passed between them that evening, across the kitchen table, when she set a cup of herb tea in front of him without being asked. Not love, not even trust, but a recognition. 2 people who'd both learned what it meant to stand alone, seeing each other clearly for the first time. But recognition, it turned out, was the easy part. Hanoka had a gift that Kasumi didn't. The ability to walk into a room and make it feel warm. Within a week of arriving at the ranch, she had learned to make coffee on the cast-iron stove, helped the cook prepare meals, and laughed at the hands' jokes with a timing that suggested she understood more English than she let on. She wore her kimono lighter and brighter than Kasumi's, pale blues and soft greens, and she moved through the ranch house like someone who'd been practicing belonging her whole life. The ranch hands preferred her company within days, and nobody blamed them, because Hanoka was easy to be around, and Kasumi wasn't. Hanoka didn't resent her sister openly. She was subtler than that, and she had been subtler than that her entire life. She made small comments that planted doubt the way a gardener plants seeds, each one harmless on its own, each one designed to grow. She told the cook that Kasumi had always been quiet, even as a child, and that their mother had worried about her. She mentioned to the foreman, in passing, that Kasumi didn't like to be touched, and never had. She asked one of the hands, with genuine concern in her voice, whether Tucker had seemed happy lately, because she'd noticed he and Kasumi barely spoke at meals. Every comment was offered with a smile and a tone that said she was only worried about her sister, and every comment left a residue that didn't wash off. The town women came to the ranch on a Saturday, bringing food as a pretext to see the Japanese wives. They warmed to Hanoka immediately, because Hanoka served them tea in the parlor, and asked about their children, and smiled at the right moments, and made the whole visit feel like something they'd chosen rather than something they'd been driven to by curiosity. They avoided Kasumi, who sat in the kitchen grinding herbs and didn't look up when they passed through, and one of them whispered to another that it was a shame Tucker hadn't chosen the friendly one. Another said she'd heard the quiet one was simple, and a third said she'd heard the quiet one was Chinese, getting the country wrong in a way that would have been funny if it hadn't been so ordinary. Tucker overheard one of Hanoka's comments on the porch one evening, something about their mother's worry, and he paused in the doorway long enough to catch the tail of it before walking past without a word. He didn't confront Hanoka because he'd learned that confronting someone who traded in concern was like wrestling water. But he watched Kasumi more carefully after that, not with doubt, with the attention of a man standing in front of a locked door and trying to figure out whether the key was on his side or hers. That night, they sat on the porch in the dark. The kerosene lantern between them threw a flickering amber light that moved across the porch boards like something alive, and the air smelled of sage and cooling dust. Tucker said nothing. Kasumi said nothing. They sat in the kind of silence that would have been uncomfortable between strangers, but between them had become a language of its own. After a long time, Kasumi spoke. She said, "I will not shame you." 4 words, spoken plainly, without emphasis, the way someone states a fact about the weather. Tucker looked at her in the lantern light, and her face gave him nothing. The same high cheekbones and dark eyes and straight black hair pinned in its knot, the same stillness. He didn't know what she meant. She didn't explain, and they sat in the amber dark until the lantern burned low, and she stood and went inside, and Tucker stayed on the porch a long time after, turning the words over and feeling their weight without understanding their shape. The man who rode into the basin that week was named Slade, and he came with 7 riders behind him. They weren't a gang in name, because gangs had names, and these men didn't need one. But they were a gang in practice, and the practice was simple. They rode onto a spread, took what they wanted, and left the owner a choice between signing over his cattle or dying in his own yard. 3 ranches in the territory had already made that choice in the past 2 months, and the law hadn't moved because there was no law to move. The sheriff in town was a clerk with a badge. The nearest federal marshal was 3 weeks away, and the territory between them was the kind of place where men with guns made their own rules, and everyone else lived by them. Slade heard about the Vance ranch from a drunk in the saloon who thought he was telling a joke. The drunk said the wealthiest rancher in the basin had sent across the ocean for a wife and gotten 2 Japanese women instead, and the punchline was that he'd chosen the ugly one. The drunk laughed at his own joke, and Slade didn't laugh, because Slade didn't find it funny. He found it useful. A rancher distracted by a foreign wife was a rancher not watching his fence line, and a big spread with a small crew was a spread that couldn't put up a fight. Slade rode out to the Vance ranch on a Thursday morning, alone, under the pretense of buying cattle. He was a lean man with a scar across his jaw and the kind of eyes that measured everything they saw, and he sat his horse at the gate with the casual confidence of someone who already knew how the conversation would end. Tucker met him at the gate, and they talked about cattle prices and grass conditions and the weather, and the whole time Slade's eyes were doing their own work. He counted the outbuildings, the barn, the bunkhouse, the hands in the yard. He saw 4 men, 3 rifles on the bunkhouse wall through the open door, and a revolver on Tucker's hip. He saw the house, big for a frontier operation, well kept, the kind of place that had money behind it. Then he saw the woman. She crossed the yard carrying a water bucket, a small framed Japanese woman in a dark kimono with her hair pinned in a knot, and she walked past the two men at the gate without looking at either of them. Slade watched her go, and something in the way she moved, the straight line of her back, the unhurried pace, registered in the back of his mind without settling into a thought. He looked away. Slade made his move before he left. He told Tucker in a friendly voice that cattle had been going missing in the territory, that a man with a big spread and few hands might want to make arrangements, and that arrangements could mean a lot of things depending on who was making them. Tucker stood at the gate with his arms at his sides and listened to every word and understood exactly what Slade was saying. He didn't blink, and he didn't agree, and he didn't make any arrangements. Slade rode out the way he'd come in, easy and unhurried, and Tucker stood at the gate, watching him until he was a speck on the southern road. Kasumi appeared beside Tucker. She had been standing in the barn doorway through the entire visit, and Tucker hadn't known she was there. He looked at her, and she looked at the road where Slade had disappeared, and neither of them spoke for a moment. Then Tucker said, "How many men did you count?" Kasumi said, 8. 1 stayed at the ridge. Tucker looked at her differently than he ever had, and the look wasn't surprise or confusion. It was the look of a man who just found out the door he'd been trying to open had never been locked. Tucker rode to town the next morning and asked the sheriff for help. The sheriff listened, nodded, expressed sympathy, and explained that he had one deputy and no authority outside the town limits, and that what happened on Tucker's land was Tucker's problem. The sheriff told him, with genuine regret, because he liked Tucker and he knew what was coming, but regret and a badge didn't add up to a posse. Tucker left the sheriff's office and rode to the 2 neighboring ranches that hadn't already been hit, and at each one he got the same answer. The first rancher told him he couldn't fight 8 men with 4 hands and a shotgun. The second said he was sorry, genuinely sorry, but sorry didn't load a rifle. Both men looked at Tucker the way people look at someone they expect to read about later, and Tucker rode home with the knowledge settling in his chest like a stone. No one was coming. He had 4 ranch hands, himself, 3 rifles, and a revolver. He had 2 Japanese women, one of whom had just told him how many men she'd counted from a barn doorway without being asked, and the other of whom had spent the morning making the cook laugh. Tucker didn't say any of this out loud, because saying it would have made it real in a way that thinking it didn't. He just started working. He moved the cattle to the high pasture, where they'd be harder to drive off, barricaded the yard gate with timber and wire, and distributed the 3 rifles among the steadiest hands. Jed took one, a hand named Clark took the second, and the third went to a quiet man who didn't talk much, but could shoot. Tucker kept his revolver, and the knowledge that when the bullets ran out, there wasn't going to be a second chance to load. The hands were nervous, and they had a right to be, because they'd signed on to push cattle and mend fences, not to fight a war against 8 men who'd already won 3. Kasumi watched the preparations from the porch, and she didn't participate, and she didn't offer advice. When the last hand had gone to his post, and the yard was empty, she went inside and came back with something the ranch hands had seen in her trunk, but never asked about. It was the bundle from the buckboard, still wrapped in oilcloth, narrow at one end and wider at the other, and she carried it across the yard to the barn with the same measured step she carried everything. She unwrapped it on the barn floor. Inside the oilcloth was a blade, curved and single-edged, mounted on a short iron tang with no shaft. It was oiled and sharp, and the steel had a grain to it that caught the lantern light in a way the barn tools didn't. It was a weapon, clearly, but not a weapon any man in the territory would have recognized, because it had no handle and no scabbard, and it didn't look like a knife or a sword. It looked like a piece of something larger, which is exactly what it was. Kasumi found an oak pole among the barn tools, straight-grained and solid, the right length and the right weight. She worked through the night, fitting the blade to the shaft, driving wedges into the tang, and binding the joint with leather cord pulled tight enough to sing. She sharpened the blade on the whetstone until the edge caught no light at all, and she tested the balance by swinging it once, slow and low, and the pole arm cut the air with a sound like cloth tearing. It was called a naginata, a woman's weapon in the country it came from, and a weapon no one in this country had a name for. Tucker found her in the barn at dawn. She was sitting on a hay bale with the naginata across her knees, cleaning the blade with an oiled cloth, and the lantern had burned out, and the first gray light was coming through the barn slats. He stood in the doorway and looked at the weapon and didn't recognize it, because nothing in his experience had a shape like that. He asked her what it was, and she said, "It was my mother's, and her mother's before her." He waited for more, because there should have been more, and she gave him the same thing she always gave him, which was enough, and not a word beyond it. He had learned by now that she told him what he needed to know when he needed to know it, and the rest would come when it came, or it wouldn't come at all, and either way she would handle it. They came 3 nights later, in the dark, through the back fence where the land dipped toward the creek. The kerosene lanterns in the ranch house were turned low, and the yard was black except for a sliver of moon that gave the outbuildings a silver edge and left everything else to imagination. 8 men on horseback, moving quiet, cutting the fence wire with pliers and leading their horses through the gap in single file. They'd done this before, 3 times, and the routine was the same each time, coming quiet, hitting hard, and gone by dawn. The first shot was the barn door kicked open. The horses inside screamed and threw themselves against their stalls, and the sound filled the yard like something physical. Clark fired from the bunkhouse window, a rifle shot that went wide and sparked off the barn's iron weather vane, and the return fire came from 3 directions at once. The window frame around Clark splintered, and a bullet caught him in the shoulder and spun him off his perch and onto the floor. He dropped the rifle and pressed his hand against the wound, and the blood came through his fingers, hot and fast. Tucker was in the yard with his revolver, crouched behind the water trough, and he fired twice at a rider crossing the open ground. The first shot missed, and the second caught the man in the chest and dropped him from the saddle. The horse bolted, and the other riders spread out, using the barn and the corral and the bunkhouse for cover, and the firefight became a series of sharp exchanges that lasted less than 2 minutes and settled nothing in Tucker's favor. A bullet hit the trough beside his head and sprayed water and wood splinters across his face, and then a second bullet caught him in the side, below the ribs, and the pain went through him like a hot wire and dropped him flat behind the trough with his legs under him. Jed was in the bunkhouse with a rifle pinned at the window, and he couldn't move without drawing fire. The 4th hand was behind the corral, and the 5th was frozen in the kitchen doorway, unable to make himself step outside. The fight was over in 90 seconds, and it hadn't been much of a fight to begin with. 4 men with 3 rifles and a revolver against 8 men who did this for a living, and the math was the math. Slade walked into the yard. He didn't rush because there was no reason to rush, and he stepped over the man Tucker had shot without looking down. He stood 10 feet from the water trough where Tucker lay bleeding into the dirt, and he spoke in a conversational voice that carried in the quiet. He told Tucker it was over, that he could keep his life if he signed over the cattle and the land, and that a man who signed was a man who'd lived to see another season. Tucker's revolver was empty, and the blood pooling under him was dark and spreading, and his hands were shaking in a way he couldn't control. Inside the house, Hanoka was pressed against the parlor wall, with her hands over her ears, shaking, her face wet with tears. She had heard the shooting and the screaming horses and the sound of glass breaking when a bullet came through the kitchen window, and she was curled into herself in the way a person curls when they've decided the world is ending and the only thing left is to make yourself small. Kasumi wasn't beside her, and she wasn't in the house at all. The yard is lit by the sliver of moon and the amber glow of a lantern still burning in the bunkhouse window. The shooting has stopped, and the silence that follows is worse than the noise, because silence after gunfire means someone has won and someone has lost, and the winner is the one still standing. A figure steps out of the barn doorway. She is small-framed, thinner than any of the men in the yard, and she has changed from her kimono into a simple wrapped garment that allows her arms and legs to move. Her jet black hair is pulled back tight, and her face in the moonlight is the same face it has always been: high cheekbones and dark eyes, and an expression that gives nothing. She carries the naginata in both hands, the oak shaft across her body, the curved blade at the end catching the moonlight along its edge. She doesn't run. She walks into the yard the way she walked into it the first day, with the posture of someone who expects to be tested. Slade sees her. His men see her. The Japanese woman, the quiet one, the one who carried water and ground herbs and sat in the kitchen while the men handled the fighting. Slade laughs, a short sound with no warmth in it, and he tells her to go back inside. She doesn't go back inside. She keeps walking, and the distance between her and the nearest rider closes from 20 feet to 15 to 10, and the naginata comes off her shoulder and settles into a two-handed grip with the blade forward. The first man raises his revolver, and she is already inside his reach when his arm comes up. The naginata's blade is longer than a man's arm, and longer than a revolver's barrel at this distance, and it comes across his wrist in a single horizontal arc that opens the leather of his glove and the skin beneath it. The sound it makes isn't what anyone expects. It is clean and wet, a crack followed by a hiss, and the man's revolver hits the dirt with his fingers still wrapped around it. He drops, and the sound he makes is the sound of someone who has just understood something too late. Two men fire. She is already moving, shifting behind the barn wall and the water trough, and the bullets hit wood and water and empty air. The naginata sweeps low, the blade catching a horse's foreleg, and the animal screams and bucks its rider into the dirt. She comes around the corner high, the blade driving forward in a thrust that catches a man in the shoulder and pins him against the corral fence. She fights the way she does everything else, with stillness between movements, no wasted motion, no sound, each strike placed with the same precision she used when she pressed needles into Jed's thigh a month ago. A man charges her with a knife. He is big and he is fast, and he closes the distance thinking that a pole arm is useless at grappling range. She lets him come. When he is close enough to grab, she drives the butt of the naginata into his throat, and he staggers, and the blade comes down across his arm in a motion that starts at the shoulder and ends at the wrist. He drops the knife and drops to his knees, and she is already turning to the next man. Slade is the last one standing. He has watched 7 men go down in under a minute, and he has figured it wrong the way everyone figures it wrong. He thinks she is lucky that a woman with a polearm got the drop on men who were distracted and overconfident, that one clean shot will end it. He draws his revolver, levels it, and fires. She shifts, and the bullet tears through the sleeve of her garment, and she feels the heat of it along her arm and doesn't stop. She closes the gap in 2 steps, and the naginata's blade stops 1 inch from Slade's throat, and the yard is silent except for the horses and the groaning of wounded men, and the sound of her breathing, which is steady and slow. She doesn't kill him. She holds him there, the blade at his throat, and she speaks in a voice that is flat and quiet, and carries in the silence the way a stone carries when it drops into still water. She tells him to take his men and ride, and she tells him that if he comes back, she will not stop the blade. She says it once, and she doesn't repeat it, and she doesn't blink, and Slade looks at her face in the moonlight and sees the same thing Tucker saw the day the buckboard arrived. A decision already made. Slade believes her. He gathers his wounded, loads the ones who can't ride onto shared saddles, and rides south without looking back. The yard empties, and the dust settles, and the moon moves behind a cloud, and Kasumi stands in the center of the yard with the naginata across her body and blood on the blade that isn't hers. Tucker is watching from behind the water trough, conscious, bleeding, his hand pressed against the wound in his side, and he has seen everything. The ranch hands have seen everything from the bunkhouse windows. Hanoka has seen everything from the kitchen doorway, where she stands with her hands at her sides and her face empty of everything she thought she knew about her sister. Dawn came gray and slow, and the yard was a thing no one in the territory had seen before. Blood in the dirt, glass on the kitchen floor, bullet holes in the barn wall and the bunkhouse frame and the water trough, and a horse with a cut foreleg standing three-legged in the corral. Tucker was alive because Kasumi had knelt beside him in the dark after Slade rode out, opened her medicine box, and packed the wound in his side with herbs that slowed the bleeding. She had pressed needles into points along his torso, the same hands and the same tools she'd used on Jed's leg, and the blood had stopped spreading, and the pain had eased from a white-hot wire in his side to a dull ache he could breathe through. He would live, and he would carry a scar, and he would carry the memory of watching his wife walk into the yard with a blade that had no business existing in this country. The sheriff arrived mid-morning with the two neighboring ranchers, the same men who'd refused to ride with him the day before. They'd heard the shooting from across the basin, or they'd heard about it from a rider who passed through, and they came late and sheepish and stood in the yard looking at what 8 men had done and what 1 woman had done back. The sheriff looked at the blood that wasn't Tucker's, at the bullet holes, at the drag marks where the wounded had been pulled onto horses. He looked at Kasumi, who sat on the porch step cleaning the naginata blade with an oiled cloth, calm, methodical, the same hands that had ground herbs the morning she arrived. He opened his mouth and closed it, and opened it again, and didn't speak, because there was nothing to say that the yard hadn't already said. Hanoka sat down on the porch step beside Kasumi. She didn't say anything for a long time, and the two sisters sat in the morning light with the naginata between them, and the silence was different from the silence Kasumi shared with Tucker. This silence had a lifetime in it. Then Hanoka spoke. "You never told me you kept it." Kasumi answered, "You never asked." And the words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything between them, because Hanoka had always known. She had known what Kasumi was, and what she carried, and what she was capable of, and she had spent her whole life being the loud one, the warm one, the easy one, because she was afraid of what the quiet one held inside her. And now the quiet one had used it, and the world was different, and Hanoka was sitting beside her on a porch step in a country that wasn't theirs, and the weapon between them was the only honest thing either of them had brought from home. They carried Tucker inside and laid him on the bed, and Kasumi went to work on his wound with the herbs and the needles and the steady hands that had already saved 2 men on this ranch. As they settled him against the pillow, Tucker caught her wrist, not hard, just enough to stop her. He told her, "I chose right." She didn't answer, and she didn't need to, because her hands went back to the work, and the work was the answer. She ground the herbs, she prepared the poultice, and she sat beside his bed through the morning and into the afternoon, and the medicine box sat on the nightstand beside them, the cranes and cherry blossoms on its lacquered surface catching the light from the window like something that had finally found the right shelf. Kasumi sat on the porch at dusk, the naginata in its oilcloth wrapping beside the medicine box. 2 objects from a world that no longer existed, keeping watch over a new one. She hadn't asked for this place, and it had asked for her, and she'd answered the only way she knew how. Drop a comment with your city. I want to see how far this story travels.